Today is day 2 of meetings between the U.S. and China. China is pressing the U.S. on how it will tame the fiscal deficit and protect the dollar's value. The U.S., for its part, pushing China to rely more on domestic demand, less on exports for growth. Joining us now to discuss some of what's on the agenda is lecturer and author George Friedman. He's the CEO of Stratfor, a global intelligence company referred to by Barron's as the shadow CIA. George, glad to have you in the studio with us. So we're day 2 of 2. I mean, how much, based on what you've heard from the first day, has really been accomplished in these talks?
These talks are not about accomplishing anything. It's about holding them. The Chinese delegation is 150 people. The Americans have about 300 in there. 5 people can't decide where to have lunch. So accomplishing something with this size meeting, it's not going to happen. But it sets the tone for relationships.
What is realistic then? You say setting a tone. I mean, what's the best case scenario then? Let's just say when the meetings wrap up today that China and the U.S. both walk away with a feeling that it's more possible to work together?
Well, the Chinese are doing one thing. The Chinese are really publicizing this. This is huge in China. They're trying to say this establishes they're the equal of the United States. On a substantial basis, they're criticizing the United States for its macroeconomic policy and saying, look, we're the biggest investor in the United States. We're really worried about the status. That makes them feel good. The United States is saying, well, that's really interesting, but you're not going to pull your money out. You can't, because if you did, it would tank the American economy. And the biggest export of the United States right now is unemployment. And unemployment is the thing that the Chinese are terrified of. Yesterday, a plant was shut down. There were riots. The general manager in China was killed. The Chinese are terrified of instability. So the thing they're most afraid of is the American savings rate. The more that goes up, the less the U.S. imports.
So is it the job then of the U.S. Diplomats to reassure China that, you know, the recession is closing up, that we are going to see so-called greener pastures?
I think the Americans want to make it very clear that the Chinese have a bigger stake in the American economy's recovery than the Americans do. We can live with the recession better than the Chinese can. The Chinese are wholly dependent on the American economy recovering to pull themselves out. And what's really happening here is the Chinese have come to give warnings, and the administration is delivering a bunch of warnings back as to what's going to happen if the Chinese don't behave.
So what do you think the U.S. then wants in exchange? If the U.S. wants to show that it has more leverage, what do you think it wants in exchange from China?
Basically, it wants the Chinese to increase their own internal stimulus, buy more of their goods, and invest more in the United States. And what they really want more than anything else is the Chinese to realize, which the Chinese know already, they're the hostage of the United States, not the other way around.
You mentioned something about sort of the Chinese coming to the table with a lot of complaints, the U.S. as well. I mean, is this really different than times past? And in fact, it's one of the reasons that even you alluded to. It's hard to get progress because it seems both sides just come to the table and complain.
This is exactly what's happened in the past. You know, the structural relationship between the U.S. and China is not subject to a group of politicians sitting and discussing it. This is an ongoing thing. What's really interesting is the continuity of the Obama foreign policy toward China and other countries to the Bush foreign policy. I mean, there has been very little change in the way we're treating the world.
So for all the talk of change, from where you sit, you see none?
There is very little, except in Afghanistan, where we got more aggressive.
Okay. Let's switch gears a little bit, move away from China. Vice President Joe Biden, of course, making some comments on Russia. You and I were speaking before we started this interview, and I was saying, you know, Joe Biden is sort of known for being a loose cannon, but you said this time these comments were very planned.
They were both planned, and it was stated by Biden because he is a loose cannon, so later they could deny them. What he basically said was there's a reason we're not worried about the Russians. And the reason we're not worried about the Russians is their economy is so weak. And because their economy is weak, it's just not, they can't be taken seriously. One of the things that everybody forgets is the Russian economy has always been weak. Throughout the Cold War, it was weak. Before World War II, it was weak. That has nothing to do with the Russian military power.
What about the idea that we are seeing this kind of comeback in commodities? I mean, obviously the Russians have a lot invested in the energy sector. They make a lot of money from rising energy prices. So you don't see that as a support to their economy? It's
certainly a support to their economy. But one of the things to remember is that the Russians have always been able to transfer money to the military sector because they have the secret police. And they've always been much stronger than their economy allows. So I think Biden is whistling in the dark here.
George, thanks so much for coming in. George Friedman there, CEO of Stratfor.